Hi, this is the recording to accompany the slides for the lecture on muscle tissue. My name is Dr. Alita Partes-Darso, and I'll be walking you through these slides. So to start off with, this is an overview of what we're going to cover in this lecture. So we're going to start off with the basics where we talk about the properties of muscle tissue in general. We're going to talk about the types of muscles that are found in the human body, and then cover the basics of smooth and cardiac muscle. The rest of the lecture will focus on the third type of muscle, which is the skeletal muscle. So with that in mind, we're going to first talk about the structure, the anatomy of the skeletal muscle, followed by the function, the physiology of the skeletal muscle, and then finish off by talking about a few other things that are relevant to the structure and function of the skeletal muscle. Again, I just thought I'd pop in this very colorful diagram that we're going to talk about as we progress. So, just in general, I'm going to first talk about the properties of muscle tissue. So all muscles have got these characteristics. They're able to contract, to shorten, and to relax, and that contraction and relaxation helps to produce movement, either movement of a body part or movement of something through the body, but it actually all helps to produce movement. All muscles also have the characteristic of extensibility, so they're able to extend or stretch, and they're also able to return back to their resting length. The third characteristic of all muscles is that they're excitable, or if you want to put it, irritable. And so the excitability of muscles allow the nervous system to control it, to produce a response in muscles, and it also then allow other things such as hormones and local stimuli to actually control it. Right? All muscles are richly supplied by blood vessels for nourishment, oxygen delivery, and waste removal, because muscles are constantly being used, whether we're awake or asleep. Right? So our muscles are constantly in action, and so it needs a huge supply of blood in order to actually provide for nourishment as well as for waste removal. When we talk about skeletal muscles in particular, they are responsible for maintaining posture, for producing heat, for moving our body parts or our body as a whole, and to also help to protect internal organs. Right? Internal organs supports weight of organs, keeps joints and bones from being overstressed. In terms of the types of muscle tissue, you can see here there are three different types. So skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. So skeletal muscle is what we're going to focus the majority of this lecture on. So in terms of its anatomy, skeletal muscle cells contain more than one nucleus, so they're multi-nucleated. They're also sometimes referred to as striated muscles. So striated means that there are layers or bands in this case. So you've got bands of dark and light. So they're considered striated muscle. And the function of skeletal muscle is to move the skeleton. They're often connected to bones. So they help to move body parts as well as our body as a whole. Skeletal muscle, as I said, are usually connected to bones, or in the case of our face, they're connected to the fascia. Second type of muscle is the cardiac muscle. So cardiac refers to the heart. So cardiac muscles are only found in the heart, and they're also sometimes referred to as striated muscle because they've got these bands, again, like the skeletal muscles, of light and dark. Each cardiac muscle cell contains 1 to 2 nuclei, and they've got branching cells with intercalated discs organized as a syncytium to allow for coordinated contraction. Again, we're going to talk about that briefly in in the next slide. And the function of the heart is to pump blood through the blood vessels so that it can reach all the tissues in our body. Third type of muscle is called the smooth muscle. So again, it does not have striata or strata, and so it looks smooth, right? There's no bands of light and dark, so it's all sort of one continuum. So in terms of its anatomy, each smooth muscle cell contains one nucleus, and so the name comes from when you look down a microscope, it looks smooth, it's non-striated. So smooth muscles are not within our voluntary control. So it is responsible for goosebumps. It helps to move food through the digestive tract, blood through the circulatory system, and other parts of other fluids and whatnot through different parts of the body. So smooth muscle are found in organs, in ducts throughout the body, and we're going to talk about that as we progress on in this course. So one slide on cardiac muscle, one slide on smooth muscle, and then the rest of the lecture will be on skeletal muscle. So when you think about the heart and you think about the heart pumping, the heart has to pump in a coordinated fashion, right? So the cells that control the rate of the pumping of the heart are called pacemaker cells, right? And that's why sometimes when our pacemaker cells don't work, then you probably know of a person or two that has a pacemaker inserted or implanted into them. And that pacemaker machine takes over the function of the pacemaker cells. If the heart is not pumping, is not contracting and relaxing in a coordinated fashion, what happens is blood doesn't leave efficiently from the heart. Blood doesn't travel through the blood vessels efficiently. Blood doesn't reach all the different tissues and cells of the body. In terms of similarity of cardiac muscle with skeletal muscle, as I said, they are striated, so they've got these bands of light and dark, and they're organized into these sarcomeres. And we're going to talk about sarcomeres when we move on to talk about skeletal muscle. Differences with skeletal muscle, it contains only 1 to 2 nuclei, where skeletal muscles are multinucleated. It's got a lot of mitochondria, and remember, mitochondria produce ATP, right? It's got a lot of proteins called myoglobin, and this mitochondria and myoglobin helps to keep the heart with enough energy in order for it to just keep on going, right? Even when we're sleeping, even when we're dreaming, even when we're eating, especially when we're running. Okay, and they've got these branch fibers as well as intercalated disc. So if you look at the diagram at the top, these intercalated disc in the bright blue consists of the sarcolemma. So the sarcolemma is the plasma membrane of a muscle cell. So it consists of the plasma membrane of the muscle cell with gap junctions. And remember what gap junctions are? Gap junctions are these pathways from one cell to another that allows ions to go straight through from cell 1 to cell 2 very, very quickly in a coordinated fashion. Right? So intercalated disc consists of gap junctions as well as desmosomes. So desmosomes, remember, are those cell-to-cell connections that help to keep the cell together. And the desmosomes are especially important in cardiac muscles because the heart is constantly beating. And so you want the combination of the gap junctions to allow ions to flow from cell to cell, from one part of the heart to another in order for coordinated contraction to occur. And remember that coordination is very important in order for the heart to actually function properly. In terms of smooth muscles don't have that bands of light and dark, so they look smooth. Um, they are they have some similarity with skeletal muscle in that they also contain actin and myosin, thin and thick filaments, but they're different because they only have one nucleus. They're spindle shaped, so they're narrower at the ends than they are in the middle, and they don't contain um, the functional unit sarcomeres, or don't contain the proteins troponin and tropomyosin. The thin filaments in a smooth muscle is anchored by dense bodies. So you can see over here, the dense bodies basically anchor the ends of the thin filaments, and the dense bodies act similarly, have a similar function to the Z discs of skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle, a smooth muscle, also require calcium to enter in. But when calcium enters in from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the extracellular fluid, it binds to the regulatory protein calmodulin. And we'll talk about this more as we progress on in the lecture. So you can see here, this is the length of a relaxed, smooth muscle cell. It's that long. And then when it contracts, it shortens, right? So that's it. The rest of the lecture is going to be dealing with skeletal muscle. So we're going to start off by looking at the layers of connective tissue that cover our skeletal muscle. So you've got, if you look over here, you've got epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. So mysium refers to muscle. You have epimysium on the outside, perimysium in the middle, and endomysium on the inside, right? So it goes, the epimysium is the most superficial layer. So you can see over here, the epimysium is dense, irregular connective tissue. It separates out the muscle from other tissues and organs in that region, allows the muscle to move independently. And you can see here the epimysium covers the entire muscle organ. The perimysium is the next layer down. So you can see here the perimysium is the middle layer, and you can see here the perimysium covers each muscle fascicle. So each of these group is called a fascicle, and you've got a layer of perimysium covering this. And the finest layer of connective tissue is the endomysium, and you can see here that the endomysium covers each muscle fiber. So you can see here, this is the endomysium, this is a muscle fiber here, and the muscle fibers are made of many different myofibrils, right? So myo refers to muscle, fibrils refer to fiber. So myofibrils are small muscle fibers, and combined together they form a muscle fiber. So if you look at the structure of the muscle right from the beginning, so you've got these myofibrils that we're going to talk about in the next slide. And what happens is you've got a bundle of myofibrils that make up a muscle fiber, and then you've got bundles of muscle fibers that make up a muscle fascicle, and you've got bundles of muscle fascicles that make up the entire skeletal muscle organ. All right, so that's how it goes. When we look at the myofibrils itself and we look at the structure of the myofibril, what we can see is this. So you can see here, this is a myofibril over here. This is just an enlarged picture of that. And what you can see here is you can see various components. So surrounding the myofibril, you've got the sarcolemma. So the sarcolemma refers to the plasma membrane of muscle fibers. The sarcoplasm refers to the cytoplasm of muscle fibers. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is a type of endoplasmic reticulum that's found in muscles. And then the sarcomere is also a functional unit of skeletal muscle fibers. So when we talk about muscles, we can refer to it as mycelium, we can refer to it as myo, or we can refer to it as sarco, right? So all these refer to muscle fibers. So when you can see here, you can see the sarcolemma is the plasma membrane surrounding muscle fibers. You can't see the sarcoplasm here, but what you can see is you can see these network of smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and they help in skeletal muscles. They help to store calcium. And then you've got the sarcomere. So the sarcomere is the repeating unit or the functional unit of a skeletal muscle. This is one sarcomere. So from Z disc to Z disc is one sarcomere. And if you look in the sarcomere, we're going to look at a sarcomere in the next slide. You can see that it contains a very highly organized arrangement of contractile proteins as well as regulatory proteins. So the two contractile proteins that I'm going to talk about next is actin and myosin. So actin is the thin filament, myosin is the thick filament, and then the two regulatory proteins that I'm going to talk about 2 slides from now are troponin and tropomyosin. So you've got the structure of the skeletal muscle fiber. I'm going to then continue and talk about the functional unit of a skeletal muscle, which is the sarcomere. Right? So you can see it's cylindrical in shape. The sarcomere consists of thin and thick filaments, and it's got the Z line or Z disc as the boundary between sarcomere. So this is sarcomere number 1, and then you've got sarcomere number 2 on this side of the Z disc, and then you've got sarcomere number 3 on that side of the Z disc, right? So, so you've got this function. In terms of the thick filament, if you look here, so the thick filament is thicker than the thin filament. So you got here, in terms of the thick filament, it contains these heads, which are called myosin heads. And on the heads, they have a site to bind to ATP. ATP is the energy that the myosin fibers use. And you've also got a site to bind to the thin filament on actin. So you've got this actin binding site. So this site then binds to this sites over here. And at rest, what you can see is that these myosin binding site are covered by tropomyosin. So you see this long strand over here, that is a strand of tropomyosin. And then the tropomyosin is also held in place by these circles that represent troponin, right? So the troponin is the lock, the tropomyosin is the one that actually covers the myosin binding sites. If you go to the next slide, you can see the myofilaments are listed over here. So again, as I said, the actin or thin filament contains these myosin binding sites or active site that bind to the myosin heads. And then, as I said, the tropomyosin blocks the myosin binding sites on actin, and the troponin regulatory protein helps to lock the tropomyosin in place. So that's the structure. When we talk about the function, of the skeletal muscle, we need to actually talk about the neuromuscular junction. So according to the name, the neuromuscular junction is a connecting point, right? And the neuromuscular junction is the point that connects the nerve, neuro, and the muscle, right? So the neuromuscular junction is when the nerve over here meets the muscle down here, right? So this is the nerve here, this is the muscle. And then even bigger, this is the nerve, this is the muscle, right? So what happens is that you can see here that the nerve can transmit a signal called an action potential that then triggers the muscle to actually contract. And the absence of this nerve impulse means that the muscle relax. So again, just to talk about the concept of a membrane potential. So a membrane potential is when there is a difference across the membrane. So one side of the membrane is more negative, less positive than another. So most all living cells have a membrane potential of somewhere between minus 60 to minus 90 millivolts. When the membrane potential becomes less negative, so goes towards zero, then what happens is that this thing called depolarization occurs. And when depolarization reaches a certain point, an action potential can start. And the action potential is the one that then leads to contraction in the skeletal muscle. So the action potential or the change in membrane potential is brought about when an ion channel opens or closes, right? So you remember what an ion channel is? It's a pore protein or a doorway that ions can actually diffuse across the membrane. So when these ion channels open and close, depending on what's happening, then the membrane potential across the muscle cell can actually change. So if you look over here, what happens is when a nerve impulse travels down the nerve, it releases this neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. So you see these red dots are dots of acetylcholine. And you can see here the acetylcholine travel across the neuromuscular junction between the nerve and the muscle. And if you look in the diagram down below, what happens is the acetylcholine binds to its receptor on the sodium ion channel. And when acetylcholine binds, then the sodium ion channel opens. When the sodium ion channel opens, it allows sodium to go in. When sodium goes in, it changes the membrane potential in the muscle. So we're going to look at the sequence in the next slide. So this sequence is the first of 2 lectures on the contraction of a skeletal muscle. So first step is that an action potential reaches the end of a motor neuron. So the action potential starts somewhere in the cell body and then travels down the axon, reaches the end of the motor neuron, as you can see here in 1. And when it reaches the end of the motor neuron, then it causes the release of acetylcholine into the synapse, right, into the space between the nerve and the muscle. And as I said, the acetylcholine then binds to specific receptors on the sodium ion channel. And the sodium ions then open, sodium enters in, and then changes the membrane potential of the muscle. And then what happens is that, so it goes over here, and then the membrane, the action potential then travels into the inside of the muscle cell through this T tubules. So T tubules, T stands for transverse tubules. So T tubules are basically extension of the plasma membrane that helps to transport the action potential along the muscle cell. So from there, the membrane potential of the muscle cell changes. As I said, travels down the T tubules that you can see in 4. And then what happens is if it excites the muscle enough, then calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this is the sarcoplasmic reticulum over here, releases this yellow dots of calcium. Then what happens is that calcium then binds to the troponin. And remember, the troponin is the lock that keeps the tropomyosin in place. So when calcium binds to the troponin, then what happens is the troponin tropomyosin complex moves out of the way to expose those myosin binding site on the actin filaments. And that allows the myosin heads to bind to the active sites and forms a cross bridge, right? And what you see over here is that when the cross bridge is formed, then ADP and a phosphate group is generated. Sorry, ADP and the phosphate group that are bound to the myosin head are then released. And it allows the myosin head to enter into a cocked position. You can see it's bent over here in a cocked position, and that allows a power stroke. So in terms of the power stroke, what happens is it makes the sarcomere shorter, right? So this is when it's relaxed. This is when it's contracted. So you can see here it's significantly shorter. And then at some point, you've got a new molecule of ATP actually attaching to the myosin head. And once the ATP is attached to the myosin head, then the cross bridge is detached. The myosin head no longer can be attached to the myosin binding site. And then when that happens, ATP then breaks down to ADP and a phosphate group, and then the myosin head is ready to actually form another cycle, right? So it goes from here, then it goes all the way back down there, depending on how much action potential stimulation occurs. So this act of the skeletal muscle contracting and shortening in length is sometimes referred to as a sliding filament model of contraction, right? Because what happens is the thin filaments slide past the thick filaments within each sarcomere, right? So this is a sarcomere over here. So it's limited by the Z disc. This is the same sarcomere when it's contracted. So the Z disc are still the same. The only difference is that the thin filaments pull and slid over the thick filaments over here, right? So it's the movement of the thin filaments across and over, sliding over the thick filaments. As I said before, it requires calcium ions. So these are the calcium ions, and also requires ATP for it to happen. So without ATP, the myosin head remains attached to actin, and that's what happens right after people die. You've got rigor mortis because there's no freshly generated ATP to actually replace the ADP and phosphate. At some point, the muscle fiber has to relax, and the muscle fiber relax when there is no more nerve signal coming down the nerve, or the muscle runs out of ATP, no more energy, and becomes tired. So the sequence is that the nerve signal stops, ATP is no longer released. When ATP is no longer released, the ligand-gated sodium ion channels close up, right? And then what happens is that the membrane potential goes back to normal, becomes repolarized. The voltage-gated calcium channel in the sarcoplasmic reticulum close because of the change in voltage when it repolarizes. So calcium returns back to the SR. And sorry, calcium no longer leaves, and then calcium is pumped back into the SR using a calcium pump, and that calcium pump is an active form of active transport. It requires ATP, and then tropomyosin goes back into position to cover the active site. Troponin goes back into position to hold the tropomyosin in place, and then the skeletal muscle relaxes. So it relaxes and goes back to its original length. Speaking of sources of ATP, there are 3 different ways that ATP can be generated within muscle tissue. So you've got creatine phosphate, glycolysis, and aerobic respiration. And when you see here, aerobic respiration is the most efficient, provides 95% of ATP. Whereas the creatine phosphate can only provide 15 seconds worth of energy, and glycolysis only provides a minute burst worth of energy. So that's why oxygen is very important when you're exercising over a long period of time, because it's that oxygen that helps to fuel aerobic respiration to produce the ATP that our muscles need. So I talked about the relationship between the nerve fiber and the skeletal muscle when I talked about the neuromuscular junction. So let's talk about motor units, right? So each skeletal muscle fiber is only innervated by one motor neuron. So you look at the skeletal muscle fibers. I'm going to get another color. Maybe green color. So each of these is a different skeletal muscle fiber. And what you can see here is that each skeletal muscle fiber only has one single connection to one single motor nerve, right? So each one is connected to the nervous system by one single connection. But when you look at each motor nerve, so if you look at neuron 1 or nerve 1, which is the orange, you can see that this neuron 1 innervates or provides nerve supply to all the orange muscle fibers, right? And then the blue neuron 2, supplies all the blue motor fibers. And the burgundy neuron 3, provides nerve connections to all the burgundy muscle fibers, right? So the connection, the unit of one neuron to lots of different muscle fibers is called a motor unit, right? So a motor unit is a group of muscle fibers that's innervated by a single motor neuron, right? So motor unit 1 is the orange motor unit. You've got one motor nerve, neuron 1, innervating all the orange skeletal muscle fibers. Some motor units are small, other motor units are large. So small motor units can innervate less than 10 muscle fibers and permit very fine motor control of the muscle. So when we think about your eyes moving, they're controlled by small motor unit. It have smaller low threshold motor neurons that are more easily excitable. Whereas large motor units can supply thousands of muscle fibers, and they are more involved in larger or simple or gross movements. So the thigh muscles contain large motor units. They've got bigger motor neurons, higher threshold motor neurons. And just to actually highlight this, if you look at the bottom diagram, on the right, you've got what happens with the recruitment process. So you've got type 1, type 2A, type 2X motor units. And if you look at this, so you can see that type 1 is much smaller than type 2A, and type 2A is smaller than type 2X. So if you have someone lifting weights, it's got just one disc over here. It only recruits the smaller motor units, right? Smaller motor units recruited with one single disc. When this person puts in a second disc, it recruits the small motor unit as well as the middle-sized motor unit. You put in 3 of these discs on each side, then you recruit the smaller, the medium, as well as the larger motor units, right? So you recruit the smaller one first, and then when you need more help, you recruit a bigger one. When you need more help, you recruit an even bigger one, right? And this actually is very, very important because it helps us pick up a feather as well as to pick up a dumbbell or weights, right? It's the same hand that picks up a feather as well as the same hand that can lift heavy weights. So on that note, happy weightlifting, and I'll see you next time.